Yeah, I was a police officer for 23 years, and as I just explained, I worked undercover for around 14 of those years. But just to give it some context, it was in 1993 in the UK, we had a particular moral panic. In fact, we'd had a moral panic for years about crack cocaine, many, many years before we actually had any, because our newspapers would report on this dreadful thing that was going on and ravaging America for years and years before there was even any of it on the streets of the UK. Such was this moral panic that 4 years into my policing career, there was a government push for the police to try and do something about this terrible substance that was destroying our inner cities. Or that was the narrative anyway. And so I managed to get an attachment to a drug squad, and one day one of them said, well, do you fancy having a go at buying some crack cocaine? So that's a strange request, but I thought I'll have a go. So I took my £20 and I went and knocked on a door, and after a short conversation I came away with my £20 stone of crack. It wasn't too difficult, but that defined the next 14 years of my life. Now, I've come to realise, and in fact there's people through history have realised that there is a folly in prohibiting drugs. The author Ian Fleming called Prohibition the mother of crime. Now, he described a more glamorous kind of undercover work than I did, as you'll come to hear. But I think his words were quite prophetic. So I'll try and paint a picture for you, the kind of work that I did. As I say, it wasn't particularly glamorous. Sometimes I would pretend to be a travelling criminal, travelling burglar. I would even go shoplifting, stealing from shops to build up my legend, just basically existing in criminality. Shoplifting's great fun, by the way. If you know you're going to get away with it, it really is fantastic sport. But you can only do that as an undercover cop, I suppose. But actually, what I quickly found was the most effective way of building a legend and building a network was to actually pretend to be someone who was really struggling. So I would mingle with homeless people, people who had the most severe problematic drug use. And mostly, actually, because those people were the easiest people to manipulate. The vulnerable people are more easy to manipulate. And also they can be so well connected. They know everybody. So I'd been doing the job for quite a few years when we had a problem in the city of Nottingham. And there was an enormous amount of gun crime because there was a sort of battle, an ongoing war going on between two cartels in Nottingham. And the most notable one of these was run by a notorious gangster called Colin Gunn. And so I was put into Nottingham with a lot of pressure to find out intelligence about the gun crime, because there were literally shootings happening there every day. So I picked my mark. The person I thought was the best person to pick on and manipulate was this guy called Cammy. Now, Cammy was on bail for dealing heroin. And he was obviously struggling. He'd been dealing, actually, on behalf of the group that I actually wanted to infiltrate. So I wanted to befriend him and get him to introduce me to different levels of the gangsters in the city and the surrounding area. So I wooed Cammy. I bought him presents. I mean, one day, I remember I came to him in the small town of Mansfield near Nottingham. And I came to him with this brand new baseball cap. And I said, oh, Cammy, I lifted 20 of these, but this one I had left over, so you have it. And I can still clearly remember him. He took off his dirty baseball cap with holes in it, and he chucked it in the bin. And he put this cap on, and sort of looked at himself in the reflection in the shop window. And he was so happy. He was genuinely so happy with this baseball cap. And after a couple of weeks later, I came across Cammy, and I used to hang around with a group of them. You know, we'd meet up and discuss who to buy heroin off, who had the best heroin that day, who had the best crack. And he was leaning against the same shop window, sat against it, and he was crying, openly weeping. And I said, Cammy, mate, what's up? And he says, well, my best friend, who I went to school with, I used to hang around with all the time, every day. But we sort of went our separate ways when we were 15. He's just died playing football on a football pitch. He's only 22. You know, he went the healthy route. He went he's a sensible upbringing. And I went the different route. And, it should have been me that's dead. And I miss him, So I said, oh, Cammy, that's really rough, man. So are you going to go to the funeral? And he looked at me like I was an alien. He says, you're joking, aren't you? The last thing that family wants is some dirty smackhead turning up at their son's funeral. Which really took me back, because I think it's worth thinking about that. However low we might view somebody who is struggling with drugs, or how stigmatized they might be in society, it's often not quite as low as they look down on themselves, because he just didn't see himself worthy of going to his friend's funeral. Not for a moment. Thought it was a ridiculous idea. So, at the end of that operation, 6 months I spent with that operation, and I will come back to the details shortly, but cutting to the end of that operation, Cammy, as I say, he was on bail, and he didn't do a lot, but he was involved in the supply with me, and he was committing offences on bail. So he got arrested as well at the end of the operation. And I heard later from the interviewing team that after his interview, he'd been on suicide watch in the police cell, which meant that he had to have an officer watching him 24 hours a day. And the reason he was on suicide watch, not because he was scared of going to prison, he'd been to prison before, not because of the withdrawal from heroin or any associated depression, it was because, as he told the interviewers, he honestly believed that I was his one friend in the world. Which, as you understandably, had quite an impact on me, really. Because undercover policing is the nuclear option of policing. You cannot go into a society, a community, deal with individuals without having a massive impact on them. So it should only ever be done where there is some great benefit to it. I decided to give up undercover policing after that. It was just, I found it too stressful for those kind of reasons. But I got a phone call 2 weeks after I'd said that from someone within the covert policing world, and they said, Woodsy, we need you to do this next job. We've tried to get other people in there, they're getting rejected, and we need you because these guys, these gangsters, are even more vicious than the last ones. And I was told, and I was shown the intelligence of this group of gangsters who work in Birmingham, called the Burger Bar Boys. They're quite notorious in the UK. And they were using rape as part of their intimidation of the community. They would rape people for a drug debt. They would rape sisters, girlfriends, whatever, for a drug debt. And so I thought, I can't walk away from undercover policing because I reckon I can get into this crew. So they were taking over the heroin and crack cocaine supply for a nearby large town in Northampton. So I deployed there and again met lots of the local people and picked my marks, the people who could introduce me and get me connected with the local scene. One of which was a girl who always wore a yellow tracksuit. And I think that's probably why her street name was Uma. You know Uma Thurman from Kill Bill? Anyway, everyone knew her as Uma. Now, Uma was quite a typical problematic heroin user. But I remember she said to me one day, I can do my rattle. I can give up heroin anytime I want. And I do sometimes, and she did. But the trouble is, when I do give up heroin, I become suicidal because I then remember too clearly the sexual abuse that I received from my uncle as a child. So for her, remaining on heroin was actually a pragmatic decision to stay alive. Because heroin is not only a very powerful painkiller of the body, it's also a very powerful painkiller of the mind. So Uma, she had been she had been in sex work. She'd been exploited by a gangster, but she'd escaped that, and she was managing to live by sort of shoplifting. So we even did a bit of shoplifting together. She was amazing at it. She really was. And one day, though, because you've got to be really careful as an undercover cop, you can't be the person who landed from Mars with all the money. So sometimes you have to, to play the character. So one day I decided to play rattling, that I had no money and I was coming off heroin and I was really struggling. So I saw her early in the morning, and she looked at me and said, "Mate, you're hanging out, you're rattling." And I thought, I said, "Yeah, I'm struggling a bit." And she reached into a pocket and she gave me a £5 note. I said, "What are you doing?" She says, "Yeah, it's all I've got, but you should be able to manage the next £5 for your 10 bag." I says, but you haven't got any more. And she says, "Oh, it's fine, I'll be fine for 4 hours." And I don't think I've come across that pure generosity anywhere. That in her mind, for the next 4 hours, I needed that £5 more than she did. It was just a simple decision to give me that £5. And I have to say, that's not an isolated incident. That's actually quite common on the streets with people who really have absolutely nothing and are struggling with heroin. So I managed to, I didn't manipulate her to introduce me. I would have done without qualms, but I found somebody else who was connected to these gangsters. And this guy, I spent weeks giving him presents and winning him over. And he eventually he decided he was going to introduce me to the Burger Bar boys. And on the way to their headquarters, they'd made their sort of headquarters in a local snooker club that just basically ran the place. And on the way there, he was absolutely terrified. He was making me rehearse my story about how long we'd known each other, 2 years, where we'd met, who else we know, what we'd done together, all of these things. He was testing me on my cover story, which is the most surreal thing when you're running a cover story and someone's trying to teach you a new one. It's really, really odd. So he took me into this snooker club, and we were directed instantly into the gents' toilets. And this hooded guy came in, and he went into the cubicle, stood on the toilet and looked over the top and said, "What's this?" And then 4 hooded figures came in and started walking around me in a circle. And so the guy in the cubicle started interrogating me and my friend while these guys were walking around. And then every so often I'd get headbutted or a dig in the ribs or pushed, or I'd be pushed into the other one and I'd be headbutted back. And when someone headbutts you on the side of the ear, it really hurts. I don't know if it's happened to you. But the sense of immediate potential violence was there. It was the feeling was, what is going to happen next? And of course, it's just the classic technique to try and unsettle you, to test the validity of your answers. Anyway, we survived that, and eventually he agreed to sell to me. And he says, "Go on, what do you want?" I said, "I want 1 and 1." So, which was a 0.4 of heroin, a 0.4 of crack cocaine. And then I was into them. And so I spent a few weeks gathering the evidence of conspiracy against those people. And interestingly, actually, the intelligence about the using rape as intimidation actually ended up in an attempt at some practical policing one day, because we received some information that these 5 of the Burger Bar boys had raped this woman the night before my deployment. And So although it was unlikely she would ever report it, we had to be ready in case she did. So we had a contingency plan that because I was getting in the car where they believed the offence had happened, we had to have a contingency plan to pick up my clothing because once I was in that car, I was potentially part of the crime scene. But of course, when I met up with them, they had a different car and they'd set fire to the car on the outside of the city. But it sort of backed up this constant feeling of terror that they were managing to cultivate there. Now, again, that operation came to an end, again, after about 6 or 7 months, and it was very successful. Caught all of the Burger Bar boys. They got sort of 10 years in prison apiece. I think there was 96 people arrested for that operation, just that operation alone. Not all of them heavy drug dealers and gangsters. Lots of people who were just caught up in the crossfire. User dealers, people who were struggling with the drugs who really would have been best left alone or helped. But it was an interesting phone call I had from the guy running that job at the end of it, because he explained how many, I think it added up to 200 years of prison sentences just from that job alone. And so later on in my career, I sort of worked out that if that was an average for my job, then I put people in prison for way over 1,000 years in total. But also in that conversation from the guy in Northampton, he says, do you know, from the intelligence, we were quite happy from the intelligence that we'd caught all the dealers for Northampton. All of them. You'd got the lot. But the intelligence came from the ground that the drug supply, the heroin and crack cocaine supply for Northampton, was interrupted for as long as 2 hours. 2 whole hours. 6 or 7 months' work. So, a little disillusioned, again, I decided not to carry on with undercover work. But again, I was tempted into it to go and work in Brighton. Now, Brighton was another thing altogether. In working undercover, you have to sort of take the pulse of the street as quickly as possible. You have to sort of try and get the feel of it. And Brighton had such a large underclass of people, lots of the flotsam, the enormous amounts of rough sleepers and people who were really struggling with life. And it's much the same with many seaside towns in the United Kingdom. I think it's perhaps people who run away, and they can only run away as far as the coast because they can't get into the sea. So they end up in a seaside town. But the atmosphere in Brighton was absolutely terrifying. It was, people were tangibly terrified. And I quickly figured out the reason why. And it's because most of the heroin users would tell you that there was casual murders going on. And because there was lots of police activity, the organised crime groups that serviced Brighton were tackling the policing tactics by complete terror. Now, I travelled around the UK and worked with some really professional police. But unfortunately, the police in Brighton were not quite so professional. They were overusing the tactic in a very unimaginative way. And also, they had the most horrific lack of care for the people that they were dealing with. Casual comments like that. Brighton at the time had the highest number of drug deaths per capita in the UK by some considerable way. But when a heroin user would die, the attitude from the police would be, oh, well, maybe shoplifting will go down for the day. It's just another smackhead. What are you worried about? It was genuinely that harsh. Which I mean, police humour can be dark, but this I really struggled with. And then studying the situation in Brighton, it suddenly occurred to me, finally the penny dropped with me, that the reason every single year that I'd been working undercover, every single year that it got more and more violent, was a direct result of me. Not just me, but people like me. I mean, I do have to take a big share of that responsibility because I helped develop the tactics of undercover work in the UK. I did training, I travelled around and trained people. Because for every time the police develop new tactics, and believe me, police are brilliant at developing new tactics, we get really, really smart. We think like chess players, but it doesn't matter how clever you are, because the countermeasure from organised crime is much simpler than the police measures. The most effective pushback from organised crime is to be more violent and more intimidating, because the most successful gangster is the one who can most successfully intimidate the community. It's quite simple from the other side. So it means that undercover policing drugs and undercover work in particular is an arms race. And there's no chance of de-escalation because the harder the police try, the more violent the whole situation gets. Doesn't matter how clever you are. There's no peace treaty to be had. There's no ending, there's no slowing it down, there's only accelerating it. Over time, although of course sometimes police can be very successful and catch sometimes a big fish, like I caught Colin Gunn in Nottingham. Generally, more often than not, the police catch the ones who are the easiest to catch, which means that over time, it's like an urban Darwinian soup. The most successful ones are the more violent, and their influence grows. That's where you get a natural monopolisation of organised crime caused by policing drugs. I'll just return you to Cammie's story. Now, before that job ended, and I spent a lot of time with Cammie, he got arrested one day, and I was a bit upset about this because he was my most useful mate. And I thought, he's been arrested on bail, he's not going to be coming out. So I thought, damn, I'm going to have to work on some other people. But after a few hours, he was back out on the street. And so me and the rest of his mates just said, Cammie, mate, we thought you were going to be gone for 6 months. You know, you're on bail, what's going on? And he says, the bastards. I went into interview and they interviewed me, and then I went into my police cell, and these 2 drug squad cops came to see me in the cell. And they said, tell us some information about who supplies you, or we're going to put it out on the streets that you did do. And so we're all a bit shocked at this. And we said, Cammie, yeah, bloody hell, man, what did you do with that? What did you do? What did you say? And he says, well, I couldn't tell them anything, could I? Because I don't know if they're working for the same people that I work for. So I can't tell them anything. So I thought the best thing I can do is just refuse and then come out here and tell everyone as much as possible what's been said, and hopefully the word doesn't get to anyone that I'm a grass. And he was absolutely terrified. Terrified. Colin Gunn was he was a scary individual. I mean, he used to put it out actually on the streets that if he ever caught an undercover cop, that cop would be tortured to death. You know, he put his messages out there quite clearly. So eventually, Cammie introduced me to the lieutenant of Colin Gunn, which sort of led to the success of it. And this lieutenant was suitably vicious, almost cartoon-like. He turned up in this car, and he had like a mini-me, which I found out was his 12-year-old son. They were wearing identical tracksuits, identical sort of shaved heads, and it really was like a mini mirror image of him. So while his 12-year-old son was sat there, he had hold of me and put this big hunting knife and pressed it into my genitals. And he interrogated me for about 15 minutes with this blade pressed between my legs. Now, trust me, you don't want to have a conversation with someone with a blade pressed down there. It's not very good at all. But it worked because he trusted me, and I managed to score off him. So the next day, you know, it had been a difficult day at the office, but the next day we went back at it. But we'd been working for 4.5 months with not much time off, and 2 of my backup crew went off sick. So we needed 2 new people to make up the numbers. I was introduced to the first one, shook his hand, thought, yeah, he's no problem. The second one, just the hairs went up on the back of my neck. Now, when you've been working undercover for quite a few months, your senses become quite finely tuned, perhaps to the point even of paranoia. But this guy just was wrong, completely wrong. It was the shifty way that he looked at the floor when he shook my hand. And so I said to the guy, the DCI running the operation, I said, boss, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing today. I just can't. And so he said, yeah, no problem at all. We'll exclude them both so we don't get any unanswered questions, and we'll just tell them to park up on the edge of town and not let them know what's going on. Now, it took quite a few months, almost a year later, before Colin Gunn and his empire was dismantled. But it turned out at that time that I was right to be very suspicious about this police officer, because he was an employee of Colin Gunn. He'd been paid by him to join the police as somebody with no previous convictions, nothing suspicious about him, with the instruction of getting into the police and working his way into CID to become a detective. By the time I met him, he'd been in the job for 7 years. And Colin Gunn had paid him £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. In sentencing that police officer, the judge sentenced him to 7 years. 1 year for every year that he'd been in the police, is what he said. But what we do know from intelligence is that police officer was responsible for passing some information to the gun cartel, which resulted in at least 2 murders that we knew about. The murders of 2 witnesses to another murder in a seaside town in Lincolnshire. So at 7 years, I think he got off quite lightly. Now, in debriefing that with the senior covert police in the UK, I was a little bit taken aback by this. But the attitude completely from senior police was, Woodsy, why are you surprised? What are you on about? Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? And that was the universal attitude from the senior police. They all know that this is happening. It's the natural next tactic of organised crime. Now, in the UK, we live in a very smug, and we are smug, a smug, stable democracy. The public there has absolutely no concept at all of this kind of corruption, none at all. So it makes it very difficult to explain to people how much the war on drugs and the money that comes from it is corrupting our system. And I should make this clear, that in the UK we have the drugs market is worth £7 billion a year. It is the single biggest amount of money from any form of criminality. But more important than the amount of money is the monopolisation of that money. Because policing drugs has made, as I previously said, has caused that money to be held in fewer and fewer hands, which means that those people are more able to corrupt the system. So it is policing drugs which is causing that corruption. Just before I finished in the police, during conventional policing, when I'd finished undercover work a couple of years before, I got called to, on the border of Derbyshire, where I was a detective sergeant, I got called to a search warrant that Greater Manchester Police had been executing in this very large posh house in a village in the Peak District. The house was worth £1.5 million, £2 million, something like that. and they'd executed a search warrant to find a cannabis factory in the cellar. And there was these 12 Greater Manchester police officers, which really confused me. I thought, why on earth do you need 12 cops to do this job? And why didn't you just give us a call? You know, we could have helped you out. If the crime is going to be in our area, we'll have to do the paperwork anyway. So I asked them, why didn't you let us know? And this sergeant said to me, oh, no, we can't let anyone know. We've got clear instructions not to let anyone know. Right, I said, well, tell me about this then. And it says, well, we've been handpicked by the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police to attack the assets of a particular gangster in Manchester called Aaron Coughlin. And we can't tell anybody what we're doing because we've been handpicked, we've all been checked out individually, and we only report to the Chief Constable. Now, this is extraordinary because that means that suggests that these 12 police officers are the only 12 cops that the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester trusts. This is in a police force of, I think, 8,000 people. It's ridiculous. So I said to him, so you are the Untouchables then? And he says, well, yeah, we are. But apparently we're not allowed to call ourselves that. Which I think is interesting because in the Untouchables, of course, famous by Eliot Ness, famous in America, prohibition of alcohol there. I don't know if you're all aware of this, but the Untouchables, it was actually an ironic nickname because the press were cottoning on to the fact that prohibition was corrupting the police and corruption was becoming very, very widespread. And so Eliot Ness proudly announced to the press that his team of 12 were untouchable. So the next day there was a newspaper headline saying Untouchables, but it wasn't a proud moniker, that was mockery. That, yeah, finally we have 12 untouchable cops. So in the UK it's very difficult to talk about corruption, not least of which because the Home Office has a directive, the government has a directive to all chief constables to maintain public confidence, which means they can't be honest about the extent of the corruption that's being caused because that would undermine public confidence. So we don't have the openness about it, we can't discuss it. And when you tell the public, it's really difficult for them to take this in. So when Ian Fleming said that prohibition is the mother of crime, I think it was quite prophetic because he said that before the Misuse of Drugs Act, before most of our drugs legislation. He saw it coming, as many people did, but I don't think even he could have realised just the extent of how things have gone. I started off in my career seeing drugs in a very, very simple way. Very simple way. You made a mistake to decide to try them, and you were weak-willed not to be able to stop taking them. But it is far less simple than that. Every problematic drug user that I've met have been self-medicating for something, either child physical or sexual abuse. Drug counsellors in the UK will say that 2/3 of problematic heroin users are self-medicating for some kind of childhood, either physical or sexual abuse. I manipulated people like that, and I continued to do so, even though I was putting them at harm. I knew that getting Cammy to introduce me to these people was going to put him at increased risk. When he went to prison, people knew he'd been the person that did it. I knew that Uma was going to be more at risk because I'd been speaking to her, because I'd used her to network. I knew this because organised crime, their reaction to undercover work is to tell anyone, you bring an undercover cop to me and we're going to destroy your knees with acid, or we're going to blind you, or we're going to do all sorts of horrific things to you. But before I actually realised the harm to society that I was doing and the fact that I was contributing and causing the corruption, I took the decision that the end justified the means. But that's the word, that's the philosophy of warfare. That's battleground logic. That's where you're a general, where you think, well, I may lose some of those. Some of those people may die, but I'll win the battle. That's battleground logic. That's warfare. Which makes the war on drugs a very accurate moniker. But that's not policing. There is no other aspect of policing where you would actually decide that the end justifies the means and someone else being put at risk is worthy of your end goal. There is nothing else in policing. We should not be policing drugs. It has nothing to do with policing whatsoever. It only causes harm. And so, coming to that conclusion, I realised quite quickly I was duty-bound to share those conclusions. I have to, really. And so that's why I found LEAP, the international organisation, LEAP, which exists in 20 different countries, spreading across the world. We're in discussions to found LEAP Europe. Used to be called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Now we're called Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Still a very, very handy acronym either way. And so we are spreading across the globe because police officers can see this. We invest so much time and energy and expertise into this problem because that's what we're good at. But I think there's many of us are increasingly seeing that not only is it futile, because futile would be bad enough, we are only causing harm. So, thank you for listening to me. We're obviously going to have some questions very shortly. But please follow us on social media and support us any way you can. So thank you very much.